Hello everybody, it's that time of year again. Let's go back and take a look at all of the controllers I've reviewed. In the past, I've done a top 5 best controller for fighting games, and last year I did an awards video. But this year we're gonna do it a little differently. We're gonna do tiers. It's gonna be a pretty fun video. Let's get into it. The first category is stay away at all costs. These are terrible controllers for fighting games. And believe it or not, but 3 of these controllers on this list are made specifically for fighting games, and they're just terrible. That's the Hori Fighting Commander Octa, the Razer Ryan, and the Power Fusion Fightpad. With the Hori, there is so much potential here. I love the face buttons. And the joystick here is really good for fighting games as well. It's short and it's got an 8-way gate. But the D-pad, man, doesn't matter what I do, what firmware I use, I could not get diagonals to work on this guy. In the Ryan, I'm pretty sure you've heard of the problem that this controller has. The D-pad doesn't have a pivot. And because of that, motion input is just all messed up with this D-pad. You just cannot do circular motions on here. It's ridiculous. Now, I've heard that they updated the D-pad, and there's certain newer models that does have a pivot. But the thing is, you just don't know what you're gonna get. What they should do is just come out with a new one, a Razer Ryan 2, and make it compatible with the PS5, and we're good to go. This PowerA Fusion Fightpad has so much potential. I really like the face buttons here. They're really nice and easy to reach. And the D-pad is actually pretty decent. However, the D-pad is placed in this little concave area. If you want to do quarter circle forward, your thumb is gonna grind against this edge right here. It's such a poor design. Over time you can get used to it. What I couldn't get used to actually are the shoulder buttons. You see how this thing is stripped all the way down to the side. During gameplay, as you move your thumb around, you're gonna need your index finger on the side here as leverage, and as you move it around, this thing is so far down on the sides that's gonna cause accidental inputs all the time. Speaking of PowerA, this is the Power Fusion Pro 2, and again, we're talking about fighting games. It may be good for other types of games, but for fighting games you need to have a good D-pad, and this guy is just super heavy. I don't understand why this is so heavy. After playing on this for a little bit, your thumb is gonna get sore like crazy. And it really is an easy fix. All they gotta do is use a lighter switch, that's it. And that's really too bad because this guy actually gives you a lot of value for your money. Next we have the 8BitDo Pro 2. There's a few versions of this controller, but this one in particular, the classic version, is really bad for fighting games. And that's because of the D-pad again, and it's just so grippy and sticky, you really cannot slide your finger around. And you play fighting games, you're gonna slide your finger around like crazy, right? But this thing is just too rough. It makes it really difficult to play fighting games on it. And lastly, we got the DualSense. I actually like the DualSense a lot. It's got cool futuristic technology on it, but the D-pad, man, is such a bad D-pad. Look at this. You see how it wiggles? And this is gonna cause you to do diagonals when you don't want to. I've had so many drop combos because of this damn D-pad. If you play a lot of fighting games, do not use this controller. Alright, let's get to the next tier. This is the I can work with it tier. They're not perfect, but if you stick with it and get used to the controller, it can be very good. Let's begin with the 8BitDo controllers. I had mentioned earlier that the Pro 2 is not very good for fighting games. Now, what if there's a version that does not have this grippy D-pad? This is the Pro 2 for the Xbox. And we have the traditional Nintendo D-pad here instead of that grippy D-pad. And this controller is just great for fighting games. It looks simple, but actually has a lot of features. If you're somebody who likes the PlayStation layout, but want to play this on the Xbox, this is the perfect controller for that. Next, we have the classic M30. This is a 6-button fight pad. It obviously was inspired by the Sega controller. The D-pad is fantastic on here. There's only a couple of things that I don't like about this controller. One, the buttons are not the same size on the top row and the bottom row. So at first it feels really weird, but you'll get used to it over time. But the biggest thing for me is I have pretty big hands, and this thing is just tiny. It's pretty uncomfortable for me to use over time, but if you have smaller hands, this will be great. Next, we got the 8-bit DO NEOGEO controller. I have a love-hate relationship with this controller, but in the end, I do like it a lot. I love the big buttons here. They resemble arcade buttons. I really adore the idea of a joystick on a controller. This is great for motion inputs. You can do it so quickly. However, diagonals on here are very tricky to pull off. In fact, when I first started using this controller, I was raging on the diagonals. It's just not very accurate. And the reason for that is this thing has a square gate. To execute a diagonal, oftentimes it'll just hit one button before the other. Now the trick is to think of this thing as an arcade stick. If you want to do down back, you gotta pull it, and you gotta pull it from this side, so the top down with your thumb. It can be pretty awkward at first, but once you get used to it, it becomes really good. Same thing with down forward. You gotta use your thumb like this. That way it'll just glide in place. If you're willing to invest the time in it, this can be a great controller. Next, we have the Thrustmaster Eswap X Pro. There's a few versions of the Eswap controller, and this is the best one right here, the Xbox one. The PlayStation version does not have the trigger stop, and the S, you cannot change out the D-pad. If you have big hands, then this controller is great for you. This D-pad is actually pretty big, and the gap is pretty large between the buttons. If you have large thumbs, you won't have any problem pressing both buttons at once for diagonals. And you can get a Fighting Pad T mod for this controller. This D-pad is great for 2D fighters and motion inputs. Next, I have the Kingkong 2 Pro. I really enjoy using this controller. It just looks really classy. The D-pad's great, it's pretty accurate. The buttons are clicky. It doesn't have any back buttons or anything. But overall, this is a great general purpose controller, including for fighting games. And it even comes with this nice looking case. Very simple. Protects your controller. Next, we have the NACON Revolution V2 Pro. This guy is just packed with features. It's got trigger stops, 2 back buttons. This one's a little more useful than this one. The buttons are nice and big, and the joysticks are great on this controller. The D-pad is good for 2D fighters, but for 3D fighters, not so much. Diagonals can be hit and miss, just because you really can't feel it. And that usually happens with disc-based D-pad. It's pretty difficult for you to feel your way around to get accurate diagonals. If you don't like the disc D-pad, you can switch it out with the diamond-shaped D-pad. This D-pad is great for 3D fighters, and the fact that the buttons are smaller and closer, it makes it a lot easier for your thumb to press both of them at once. Next, we have the SCUF Instinct Pro. This is a great controller. It's essentially the same as the Xbox Series X controller, but you also get back buttons built in. Trigger stops as well. The joysticks on here are fantastic. Buttons are nice and clicky. And this cross-shaped D-pad is great for fighting games. It's nice and tactile, and this guy is actually interchangeable. You can take this out. It's magnetic, kind of like the Xbox Elite Series 2 controller. And you can replace this guy with a hybrid D-pad, just like on Xbox Series X. However, with that one, the D-pad actually lifts up if you press the D-pad too hard. And that's a major flaw in my opinion. So if you're going to get this controller, do not get the hybrid D-pad. This cross-shaped D-pad works perfectly fine for fighting games. And the final controller in this category is the FLYDIGI Apex 3. This controller just looks badass. This is a special edition controller. This is the Interstellar edition, space theme. There's a screen here, you can customize it. You can put GIFs on it. It's super cool. The face buttons are mice switches. It's got 4 back buttons. The D-pad, however, is huge and is pretty far to the right. And I have pretty big hands, but even I struggle to press forward or up forward. This controller is only good if you have really big hands. If you have smaller hands, I don't recommend it. The D-pad itself is good though. It's an 8-way D-pad. Just feels really nice. I just wish that this thing is moved further to the left a little bit. On to the next tier. These controllers are just plain solid. They're just great for fighting games. Let's begin with the DualShock 4. Honestly, I would have been happy if the DualSense controller is exactly like this. This thing is just plain old solid for fighting games. The D-pad's great. You see the D-pad here, there's not a lot of wiggle. Missed inputs are rare on this controller. It's light, it's a good size, and it's just comfortable to use. And it's great for both 2D and 3D fighters. Another simple controller that just works great for fighting games is the Hori Fighting Commander. There's 6 buttons here, so this is great for Street Fighter. Shoulder buttons, and the triggers are just plain old buttons as well. The cross-shaped D-pad is nothing new, but it works really well. You don't have to be fancy about it or anything. It's easy to press, it's responsive, the diagonals are accurate, it's smooth to slide your fingers around, and that's it. That's all you need. Next, we have the Razer Wolverine V2 Pro in Chroma. This one is for the Xbox, and this one is for the PS5. Essentially, they're the same exact controllers. The only difference is this thing has wireless capabilities, and this is a lot more expensive. Unless you only play on PS5, I would go for this guy. Now the joysticks on here are fantastic. The rotations are super smooth. The D-pad's pretty good too. Pretty easy to slide your finger around. Great for motion inputs. It's also pretty accurate for diagonals actually. And check this out. There's another set of buttons up here next to the triggers and the shoulder buttons. And back here you have 4 more buttons. These are pretty hard to reach actually, particularly the 2 on top. You gotta really stretch your finger out there to press these guys. If you like Razer, these are the best controllers that they've made for fighting games. Next, we have the Victrix Pro BFG. This guy has a lot of customization available to you, and it even comes with a 6-button module. Unfortunately, this module is not very good for fighting games, and that's because the button sits really low on the controller. You gotta really stretch your thumb to reach the square button. It's just no good. So I really don't recommend using this guy. But what I love about this controller actually is this diamond-shaped D-pad. This is great for both 2D and 3D fighters. Motion inputs are really smooth because essentially this is a disc. But at the same time, if you need good diagonals, you can just press the edge here and you can actually feel your way around. This is a fantastic design. A lot of D-pads will work great for 2D fighters, but not so good for 3D fighters and vice versa. But this guy works great on both. Next, we have the Xbox Elite Series 2 controller. The best thing about Xbox controllers are the switches. They're just super clicky and tactile. You really feel each button press. Same thing with the D-pad. Super satisfying. This disc-shaped D-pad is great for 2D fighters, and it's just super quick because you can slide your thumb around very easily. The diagonals on here unfortunately are not perfect. I recommend you switch this out for the cross-shaped D-pad. This controller just looks great. It looks awesome. It just looks and feels super premium. And the last controller on this tier is the ROG Raikiri Pro. This thing is just fantastic. The buttons are metal switches, and the D-pad is also fantastic. Super clicky. This is a disc D-pad, so naturally it's very smooth for motion inputs. These 2 D-pads here are probably the best D-pads for 2D fighters. Unfortunately, the diagonals are not as accurate on this D-pad as some of the other D-pads. And that's just due to the nature of the disc, right? You just can't really feel your way around. But over time, you do get used to it though. You do have these lines to kind of guide you. There's also an OLED display here. You can use it to customize the controller, or you can program your own image on here as well. It's got 4 back buttons. The bottom 2 are pretty good, but the top 2 are very hard to reach. And this controller has the best RGB in any controller I've ever used. It's just fantastic. This thing looks like it just came straight out of like a sci-fi movie or something, you know? Alright, let's move on up. We are almost at the top of the tier here. When you talk about these controllers are in the elite territory. We've got an Xbox controller, PlayStation controller, and a PC controller. And let's start here. This is the B-Top Thorn Shadow controller. I absolutely adore this controller. This is the best 6-button controller out there. Bar none, period, no discussion. The face buttons are super clicky. You get both the shoulder buttons and the triggers. And this is a floating D-pad. It's super easy to glide your finger around. Naturally, it's great for 2D fighters. And it's also got very accurate cardinal directions as well. It looks super cool. Look at this. Look at this Chinese writing. This thing just looks and feels badass. You can actually switch this D-pad out for another D-pad, and that other D-pad is great for 3D fighters. But the best part about this controller is it's only $25, and it just shows you don't need an expensive Pro controller to have a great fight pad. If your budget's limited and you need a great controller for fighting games, run out there and get this one right away. Speaking of expensive, we have the DualSense Edge. As much as I hate the DualSense, that's how much I love the DualSense Edge. This thing is fantastic for fighting games. They fixed the D-pad, it doesn't wiggle around anymore, and as a result, you rarely have any missed inputs anymore. And I absolutely love these 2 back buttons here. They're not quite a paddle, they're kind of short and they stay out of the way of the handles, and it's just super easy to press. And if you're a hardcore gamer, you know that wired is the way to go. And this thing has a lock. You put it on and it's secure, so you don't yank it off. The best thing about this controller is this is the fastest controller you can get. This thing goes up over 1000 Hz. What that means is you can get under 1 millisecond of input delay. If input delay is something that's important to you, there's no other controller faster than this. And finally, we have the Xbox Series X or Series S controller. Not only that this is a great general purpose controller, but the D-pad is fantastic for fighting games. If I'm playing against a high level player and I don't want the controller to get in the way, this is my go-to controller right here. This D-pad is the best of any D-pads out there. These raised edges really help you feel your way around the D-pad. I rarely ever miss my inputs with this D-pad. Diagonals are on point. And it's also good with motion input as well. Although I will say this, because of the raised edges, your finger will get sore after a while. But in terms of tactility and accuracy, there's no other D-pad that I would rather use than this guy right here. And again, I just love the switches on Xbox controllers. They're metal base switches. You really feel each button press. Not only that, but I really love the Xbox design. You see how the handles is kind of angled outwards? No wristband at all. This controller is just super ergonomic and comfortable to use even with long sessions. If I could only have one controller to use for fighting games, this guy would be it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the top of the tier. This is the God mode tier. This is the hitBOX, and this is bar none, by a mile, the best controller for fighting games. This thing allows you to do things that no controllers can do. And what do I mean by that? Well, you play like this, and all your fingers are on top of the buttons at all times. For example, if I want to do down back and then up forward, I don't have to lift my fingers up and move it around. It's just instant. Compare that with a regular controller. You gotta press down and then you gotta slide your thumb upwards. Here, all your fingers are on all buttons at all times. What that allows you to do is execute moves instantly and transition from one move to the next without sliding your hand around. If you're thinking about getting one of these, I have to warn you though, this thing is very difficult to learn. And that's mainly because the jump button is down here. You would think that this is down, right? Because it's placed at the bottom, but no, this is actually up. So if you want to do up forward, you gotta go like this. This is down forward. So the down button is up here and the up button is here, and that messes up with your brain. Really, all of our lives, this is down and this is up. But if you're able to adjust and learn it, I guarantee you there's no better controller for fighting games than the hitBOX. This thing is super accurate, it's super fast, and you can execute from one move to the next instantaneously. And these buttons spring up instantly. They are super fast. And if you need to double tap really quickly, you can do tricks like this. There are so many ways to use this controller, and honestly, this is the only controller that you can be creative with it. Currently, the only bad thing about the hitBOX is it doesn't work on the PS5, and that's more of a Sony issue than anything. I just love the look and feel of this thing. It just looks really nice. It just looks so classy. At times, it feels like I'm cheating honestly when I use this guy. It's that good. In terms of controllers for fighting games, I got 2 words for you. God mode. Alright, that's gonna be it for me. Make sure you give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more, and take care now.